I know you have spoken to Director Comey since this testimony. You can't talk about what you've discussed. Were you surprised by anything he said, or for you, what stood out?
Well, so there was material that I learned in the written statement and also the oral testimony, just stuff that we'd never talked about before that was completely new to me. So
you were surprised by the fact that he had told President Trump that President Trump was not the focus of an investigation.
Yeah. So as you know, I including conversation with you, took the view that that was completely impossible. In the wake of that conversation, I sort of started thinking, well, maybe there were some conceivable circumstances in which that would be less impossible. And I actually wrote a kind of long piece kind of imagining what the circumstances were. But the truth is that he told the president more than I would have expected that would have happened. So I definitely learned that from the testimony.
I think some people who don't know much about Director Comey were surprised that he acknowledged that he had given a document to a Columbia professor to then leak out with the idea of it motivating a special counsel. Did that surprise you at all, given what you know about him? And should people have been surprised?
No, that didn't surprise me at all. Although a lot of people seem to have, including Senator Collins, seem to have think that the intermediary in that case was me, which of course it was not.
Right, they asked if it was you.
Senator Collins actually asked him whether it was me, and he said, no. Look, I think that the right way to understand what Comey did in that situation is not the language of leaks. It's the language of whistleblowing. And those of us who were very offended by Edward Snowden and by sort of some of the kind of reckless national security leaking that we've seen over the last year, what have we always said we wanted people who had egregious misconduct to do? Well, we wanted them to stay within channels on classified material. We wanted them to not go public when there were remedies available to them within government. And we wanted, when there was non-classified material that needed to come out, to do things like call the New York Times and talk to the New York Times about egregious misconduct that took place. And so if you think about what Comey did in this situation, all the classified stuff he did not talk about. He talked about only in closed session with the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is exactly the way you're supposed to talk about classified material. He didn't leak or disclose anything while he was in government to, the incident that you're referring to is an incident after the intergovernmental remedies are no longer available to you. And the stuff that is unclassified that he felt needed to come out about some genuinely egregious misconduct by the President of the United States in interaction with him, he called a friend and said, hey, can you get this to the New York Times? And so I think the really surprising thing and the really the thing that stands out about that instant is that he went in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee and unbidden told them exactly what he did. And that's actually not something you see very often in Washington. But guess what? Senior leadership and director level leadership of agencies in the federal government actually have wide discretion to disclose material, properly to disclose material. I think if the president wants confidentiality in his interactions with his intelligence leadership on non-classified matters, it's probably worth not firing them summarily and then lying about the circumstances in which you do. And when you do that to somebody, you shouldn't really expect them to protect your confidences about that matter.
There's some Republicans who have said, well, look, Director Comey should have immediately in the Oval Office when the president was saying, let the Michael Flynn investigation go, he should have immediately said to the president, that's inappropriate. He should have stood up or gone through other channels immediately.
It's funny, not many of the Republicans who are saying that so piously can manage to do the same thing, even separated by, blocks and blocks from the president, not in a meeting with him.
They're not standing up for things they don't agree with.
They're not saying this conduct is outrageous, it's egregious, you can't behave that way, Mr. President. I haven't heard the senior leadership of the Republican Party do that even months after the fact, with lots of time to think about it, and knowing that the president subsequently intervened to frustrate this investigation and continues to this day, in fact, this morning, to threaten action against the leadership of this investigation. And so it's a little bit rich for people who can't be troubled from the safety of a Senate office to say this is unacceptable conduct, to cluck about the fact that the director of the FBI, in the presence of the president, in an unbelievable situation, with an investigation to protect, didn't scold the president. Start scolding the president yourself before you make that accusation.
The Washington Post reporting last night that Robert Mueller is looking into the possibility or allegations of obstruction of justice. How significant is that? How significant a turning point now?
Yeah, so obviously I'm not privy to the details of what Director Mueller, I'm not sure, Special Counsel Mueller, I'm not sure what you're supposed to call him now, is looking at right now. I think it's unsurprising that he is apparently looking at the obstruction question. I think it would be hard as a prosecutor to look at the pattern of activity that begins January 6th and ends, I mean, it hasn't ended, but ends with the firing of Comey and the subsequent statements, and not at least have an obstruction question. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Bob Mueller wants to explore that question. I do think it is worth not reading a huge amount into that yet. He hasn't, it's worth both not saying, therefore we know he thinks there's been an obstruction, or that we know based on what Director Comey has testified that there's not adequate evidence of obstruction. This is the question of whether an obstruction of justice has taken place is intensely factually specific. You always need all of the information in order to evaluate it in a serious way. And so I think it's A, not surprising that Mueller would be trying to get some of that information, but B, I wouldn't draw a lot of conclusions from the fact that he is, except one, which is, if the president thought he was going to make this problem go away by getting rid of Jim Comey, he has been shown to be sorely mistaken. He's clearly made it worse for himself.
And yet the president continues to tweet about it.
That's right. I mean, the president continues, including this morning, where he, I think, did something genuinely extraordinary, which was to describe an investigation that was ongoing, of which he is now some kind of a subject. As conducted as a witch hunt conducted by some very bad and conflicted people. And I'm unaware of a prior instance in which a president of the United States has talked that way about an investigation that actually hasn't done anything yet. I mean, they haven't named him in any capacity. They haven't taken major investigative steps. And I think it's just an extraordinary statement.
It's also in line with, we've seen a number of high-profile Republicans on television starting to speak against Robert Mueller, who even spoke positively of him when he was first appointed.
Correct, and the president, sort of semi-publicly entertained the idea of firing him, which is, quite would be a, very fateful and dramatic step were he actually to do it, and is even a fateful and dramatic step to publicly contemplate.
You think it would be Fateful in what way?
Well, so, I mean, most people don't have the options of firing their own prosecutors. It's not something that, if you think about sort of your average white-collar criminal suspect, doesn't get to pull the trigger, no pun intended, and fire the person who's looking into him. The president does get to do that, but to do it is both politically and legally very consequential thing. I think it would be very difficult to do without triggering the resignation of a bunch of Justice Department officials. At least I would hope that they would resign and rather than carry out the order. And the last time this happened, which was, of course, the Saturday Night Massacre during the Watergate era, that was one of the events that convinced a lot of people that the president was, in fact, probably guilty of crimes and was trying to, protect himself against the consequences of the investigation.
To Republicans who say, well, Director Comey is very close to Robert Mueller, there may be a potential conflict there, that Robert Mueller was interviewed by the president for potentially a FBI director job the day before he was appointed as a special counsel. Robert Mueller's law firm apparently represented members of the Trump family at some point, even though it's obviously a very large law firm. Are any of those things significant enough to raise concerns about Robert Mueller?
So I'm not a legal ethicist, and the question of whether somebody has a conflict of interest that is, that should preclude them from engaging in something is not something that I'm actually qualified to address in any meaningful sense. I will say this. It was known at the time of Mueller's appointment that Wilmer had some Trump family members as clients. We actually wrote about that on Lawfare and looked at the ethics issues associated with that. And it turns out those are waivable by the Justice Department, and in fact the Justice Department waived them. So I think those issues are sort of resolved. The question of what the relationship is between Mueller and Comey is, first of all, is one. I mean, I know that they're in a very small fraternity of former FBI directors, and Jim was Bob Mueller's successor and certainly thinks very highly of him. I don't know how close they are or are not, to be honest. They certainly, ran the same agency and have, at least in one direction, high regard for one another. I don't know that to be the sort of thing that has ever triggered a recusal or a declining to accept a position. The community of people who conduct these sort of investigations is very small, and they generally all know each other.
Is there anything you think that came out of Sessions' testimony that really contradicts what Director Comey said?
Well, there's one big thing, of course, which is that Comey testified that when he complained to Sessions that Sessions could not leave him alone with the president, Sessions did not respond, but sort of, kind of shrugged meekly. And Sessions' testimony is that he did respond. He responded by saying it's very important that you follow Justice Department policies and that communications only go through the Justice Department. I am not sure how consequential that difference is, but it is a difference. One of them is, they can't both be correct.
Is there anything else you think is important that's
in which their testimony is not?
Yeah, or about the obstruction of justice.
Well, look, I mean, Sessions, they're certainly tonally different on the question of Sessions' recusal, though I'm not sure that there's anything that they say that cannot be factually reconciled with one another.
Do you know, I mean, you had said the last time that Director Comey felt that there were a number of people in the White House in this administration who were not honorable. Do you know if Jeff Sessions is one of those people?
So I do not believe that when Jim made the remarks that were, formed that impression to me that that was a comment on Jeff Sessions. I think that was really a comment about the president and the people immediately around him. I don't purport to know what Comey thinks of Jeff Sessions.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.